fear, do not grieve. We will return him to you, and we will make him one of our messengers. What do we find? When Nabi Musa was caught by Asiya, and Asiya wanted to suckle him, did he suckle from her? No. When the other maids wanted to suckle him, did he suckle from them? No. When he was taken all across town, did anyone suckle Musa? No. It was only when he returned back to his mother that his mother was the first to suckle him. Therefore Allah told his mother, do not grieve. Grief is good for you, but at this stage I don't just want you to grieve, I want you to act upon your grief. That will bring a solution towards our actions. And the third usage of the word husn in the Quran, we find in Surah Yasin, a verse which we've recited all our life on a Thursday. In Surah 36 verse 21, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses the Prophet on how he should grieve. فَلَا يَحْزُنْكَ قَوْلُهُمْ إِنَّا نَعْلَمُ مَا يُسِرُّونَ وَمَا يُعْلِنُونَ. Do not let their words grieve you. Why? Rasulullah, like anyone who addresses a message to people, if the people do not listen to him, goes through a period of grief. Understandably. Imagine Rasulullah comes to these people, addresses them, tells them, come towards our way. What do? When he walks past their house, they throw trash on him. When he comes to say salam to them, they actually walk away from him. When he's in sujood, they throw the intestines of an animal on his head. Rasulullah goes through all of this, and at one stage reaches a stage where he goes into a period of grief, because he sees people who he is trying to call towards him, but are not listening to him. The Quran says to him, فَلَا يَحْزُنْكَ قَوْلُهُمْ. Do not let their words grieve you, O Muhammad. We recognize that you are a prophet and you will fall in grief because people do not listen. But act upon your grief. Use your grief to make you a stronger human being. And what do we find? Years later, in using his grief as a propeller to making him a better person, Rasulullah built a stage which no man has ever matched. The idea was that the Quran and these three verses showed us where we should show grief, how we should use grief, and how grief, when it is used, makes a person powerful. Yet the verse which I have used as the basis of my lecture is in Surah Yusuf, Surah 12 in the Quran. And it is verse 84 of Surah 12. What does the verse say? And how do we relate it to the events of Karbala in the relation of the expression of grief in the Quran? The verse says what? وَابْيَضَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ فَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ. The verse refers to Prophet Yaqub. And the verse says his eyes became whitened because of his grief, and he held in his anger. What does this mean? The schools of Tafasir tell us Nabi Yaqub has witnessed everything that had happened to Nabi Yusuf. He knew his son was thrown in a well. He knew his son was picked up by strangers. He knew his son had become a slave. He knew his son was put in prison for a crime he did not commit. He knew his son was within a group of people who did not necessarily like him. Because of all this grief, the Quran tells us his eyes whitened out of his grief. What did that mean? This meant that Nabi Yaqub, from the amount of years he cried for his son Yusuf, his eyes became blinded out of his grief. What do we take from this? We find, number one, here is a prophet of God who should be the height of controlling emotion. Yet we find that the amount of grief Allah states he showed over his son made him lose his eyesight by the middle of his life. His eyes had become whitened. This eyes becoming whitened, Allah doesn't say that his eyes became blind because of his tears. No. Allah says his eyes became blind because of his grief. Because of everything that he went through, his eyes became blind. When we use this verse, we use it in the following examination as a proof that crying is a legitimate expression of one's grief in the month of Muharram. Because there are some people who say, what's the point of us crying? Let us just come majlis, listen to the lecture, learn, and go home. Both within the school of Ahlul Bayt and outside the school of Ahlul Bayt. In the school of Ahlul Bayt, someone will come and say, here is the Maulana. He's providing you with knowledge. Listen to the knowledge. There's no need for you to cry and express all your emotion over the grief that you listen to. Whereas even our brothers outside the school of Ahlul Bayt, they say, look at these Shia, year in, year out, the same tears over one personality who died 1,300 years ago. They come forward and they say, the Prophet Muhammad himself said, crying cannot be done, especially excessive crying. There is no legitimacy to a person crying as much as the Shia cry every year in Muharram. When we reply, we use this as one of the verses of the legitimacy of crying in the month of Muharram. Yet when you use this verse, one major question pops up before you examine the rest of it. And that is, can I use the sunnah of a prophet pre-Muhammad? Can I use the actions of a prophet who has come pre-Rasulullah, with the idea being that many schools state that Rasulullah's message overrid all the prophets who had come before him. Therefore, some schools come and say, you cannot use this verse as a legitimate reason. We say to them, why? They say, Yusuf and Yaqub was years before Muhammad. Their Sharia has been overridden by Muhammad's Sharia. You using this verse as a proof that crying is legitimate is not allowed. How do we reply? We reply by saying that we can use this verse on the following grounds. Number one, and this criteria goes for all things. Number one, the religion of Yaqub is Hanifi, which means it is Abrahamic. Because it's Abrahamic, you are allowed to use the Sunnah from an Abrahamic religion. Number one. Number two, if Ahlul Bayt have used the verse for their grief, then we can use it for our grief as well. Has this verse been used by Ahlul Bayt or no? Many times by Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam. Imam Zayn al-Abidin on numerous occasions referred to this verse and this verse alone when speaking about what he saw with his father in Karbala. I'll give you an example. Abu Hamza Tamali came to him. He said to him, "Oh Imam, Karbala has long gone. Why do you continue to cry so much? Why is it that you cry over an event which has long gone?" The Imam replied to him, listen to his reply. He said, Yaqub cried for Yusuf. Listen. Yaqub cried for Yusuf. And he knew Yusuf was alive. And Yusuf was only 17 kilometers away or so from Yaqub. And his son eventually returned to him. Yet Yaqub would cry and cry and cry. I saw my father butchered on the plains of Karbala. And I saw his brother with his hands mutilated. And I saw his sons one by one killed, from a 6-month-old to an 18-year-old. I saw my nephew, I saw my cousin, and I saw my aunties the way they were treated. Do you blame me for crying years after what has happened to my father? Therefore, Imam uses this verse as a reason for his crying. On another occasion, the Imam himself states, and Imam al-Sadiq himself states, Al-Bakka'un Khamsa. There are 5 who cried more than any others. Listen to his words. He says, Adam was the first, for he cried when he was out of Jannah, for he yearned to return. The second was Yaqub, who cried over Yusuf. The third was Yusuf, who cried over Yaqub. The fourth was Fatima, who cried over the death of her father, Rasulullah. And the fifth was whom? The fifth was Imam Zayn al-Abidin, who cried over his father, Hussein. Therefore, on the second reason why we can use this verse is what? The second reason I can use this verse is because Imams of Ahlul Bayt have used this verse as a proof. Number 3, the main thing is, if a verse in the Quran or a sunnah of a previous prophet is not restricted to that particular people, then we can use it. For example, the Sabbath was the practice of Nabi Musa. That Saturday, Sabbath, was a day where you do not engage in business. But that was a sunnah only for the children of Israel. In the time of Rasulullah, it was changed to when? Friday. Therefore, that can't be used, because that particular sunnah was only for whom? Was only for the children of Israel. Even if there is a sunnah of a previous people, but it contradicts the sunnah of Rasulullah, it cannot be used. Whereas this verse about Yaqub crying until he becomes blind, for Nabi Yusuf can be used. Why? Number one, as we said, it's Abrahamic. Number two, and they choose it. Number three, it's within the Quran and not exclusive to a particular group of people. But is this the only proof of crying as an expression? Can I only use this verse? Or are there other verses in the Quran